Okay, so here we are now, but the third of the way through Luke's gospel, and we've seen a lot of things that Luke is doing as he's communicating this message of salvation. We've noticed how he will use Matthew and Mark. We saw using Jeremias's analysis, how Luke will chunk Mark. So he'll follow Mark and then he'll stop and he'll use Matthew and then his own source, and then he'll come back to Mark and for a while, then he'll stop and use Matthew and his own source, this kind of thing. Well, we're in one of those sections where Luke is going to chunk from Mark and bring in bits and pieces from Matthew from time to time. But what's most interesting today is how each of these authors in their own way are going to be telling the stories with that Luke includes in chapter 8. So let's begin. First, we are now at parables. So now Luke has shown that Jesus has this ministry. He gets rejected in Nazareth. He does several amazing healings, calls the apostles together, gives them this ethical teaching, the substratum. You have the beautiful stories in chapter 7, culminating with the woman who anoints Jesus' feet. Luke mentions how important women are to Jesus in his ministry, and there's much to discuss on that. And now he's going to go follow Mark's order again. He's going to be right there with the parable of the sower. So you're in Mark 4. You're also in Matthew 13 at this point. Matthew 13 is the center of 5 discourses. If there's 5, it's the chiastic center. The Sermon on the Mount, the missionary discourse of chapter 10. Chapter 13 is the parables. Chapter 18 is the church discourse. And chapters 24 and 25 are then the eschatological discourse. So Mark 4, here we are in Luke 8 with these particular parables, and then Matthew 13. So here again is where a number of the editorial tendencies of the writers can be seen. And so I'll just begin assuming again, remember our presupposition here. Mark writes first. Sometime later, perhaps a decade later, Matthew is going to midrash on Mark. He's going to flesh Mark out, fill it out. And then Luke will come along and use both Matthew and Mark as well as his special source, which I suggested following James Edwards, is the Hebrew gospel. And so we're going to watch these writers as they use their sources today. And again, some of these details, they don't mean a thing. Okay, so don't get all caught up in them. Sometimes they do, but oftentimes it's just the way they edit texts. And in particular, Matthew today, I was kind of laughing at. But at any rate, so in Mark, again, he began to teach beside the sea. Matthew, the same day Jesus went out of the house and sat beside the sea. Luke, a great crowd came together and people from town to town came after him. No mention of a sea. Luke just has this as Jesus somewhere, but not by the sea. Not that it matters, okay? But Luke has omitted that little bit of a geographic reference. So Matthew and Mark both know Jesus gets into a boat, and he taught them many things in parables, plural, saying, and in Luke it's just, and he said in a parable, singular, one parable. And then we have the sower sowing the seed. Now, you're very familiar with this parable, so I don't need to go into details. It's just that if you have a synopsis and you're able to look at Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John side by side, okay, there's some differences in the wording, not the structure of the parable, but in the way it's framed, okay? And so, for example, here's Mark. A sower went out to sow. And as he sowed, some seed fell along the path, and the birds came and ate it. Other seed fell on rocky ground, where it had not much soil, and immediately it sprang up, since it had no depth of soil. And when the sun rose, it was scorched, and since it had no root, it withered away. Other seed fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked it and yielded no grain. Another seed fell into the good soil. Now, that whole section about the seed falling on rocky ground is missing in Luke. Listen. A sower went out to sow his seed. As he sowed, some fell along the path and was trodden underfoot, and birds of the air devoured it. And some fell on the rock, and as it grew up, it withered away because it had no moisture. Boom! Just a real shortening of the narrative, just shortens it up. So what's that tell you? Well, it's going to tell you a couple of things. One is, and Matthew follows Mark at this point. Other seeds fell on the rocky ground where they had not much soil. Immediately they sprang up, since they had no depths of soil. When the sun rose, they were scorched. No root, they withered away. Other seeds fell upon thorns. In the story of the parable here, it's gonna turn out that in the interpretation of the parable, that when hang on, I want to get to the interpretation so I don't misinterpret it. Yeah. So in the Mark and Matthean accounts, the rocky soil is tribulation, not so in the Lucan account. But in the Markan and Matthean interpretations, that's why you have that. And the Markan Christian community could certainly perceive itself as under persecution, particularly the Jewish Christian elements within it, even as, which I don't think Mark was writing from Rome, where I think he was writing from the region around Syria. So the battle was close, he was close to it. And the same with Matthew's community, which a decade later perceives itself as being persecuted by the Jews in the synagogues who are against the Matthean Christians precisely because they follow Jesus as the Messiah. So that's why I think the Markan and Matthean narratives hang on to all of that language about the rocky soil. They're trying to say something to followers of Jesus here. For Luke, that's not an issue. Persecution's not an issue. He's writing very favorably about the Roman government. Persecution's not a big issue in Luke's gospel when it comes to the authorities, the governing authorities. However, it is a major issue when it comes to the rejection theme, the rejection of the prophet like Moses, especially. This rejection theme can turn quickly into persecution, which it does in the Passion narrative. So at any rate, we have this reason for speaking in parables. Now, when you go to Luke 8, and it says, when his disciples asked him what this parable meant, he said, to you has been given to know the secrets of the kingdom of God, but for others, they are in parables. Now, listen to Mark. To you has been given the secret of the kingdom of God, but for those outside, everything is in parables, in order that seeing they might not see, hearing they might not hear, etc. Now, it's that hina, that's that in order that has created some confusion in parable interpretation. So we want to look at this in particular, okay? It's in verse 12 of Mark chapter 4. Well, there's Pete, I'll let Pete in. It's in verse 12. In order that, and then there's the quotation from Isaiah, okay, at this point. Seeing they might not see, hearing they might not hear, lest they should turn and I should forgive them. Matthew has changed the hina into a hoti. The hoti can introduce one of three things: direct discourse, like a quotation mark. It can introduce something causal, because or for. And it can introduce a clause. And so we would use the term that. So let's look at Matthew. On account of this, I speak to them in parables, that seeing they might not see. Well, no, that has same force as hina at that point. So I speak to them in parables because seeing they don't see and hearing they don't hear. Okay, now hoti here can mean Jesus speaks in parables in order to help them see. Now, the key to this problem can be found, I think, in the teaching of Jesus by T.W. Manson. This is a much older book. This was published in the 1930s. Okay. And what Manson does in this book is he compares the Hebrew text, the Septuagint text, the Greek Old Testament, the Targums, the Aramaic paraphrases of the biblical books, and then the text in Mark. And what he comes up with and what he notes is that Mark agrees with the Targum against both the Hebrew and Septuagint, putting the verbs in the third person rather than the second. And then the second thing is, he says, the Aramaic particle de can either be translated as a relative who or as indicating purpose, hina. You can do either one with de. It makes more sense, in my opinion, that the historical Jesus would have used the de with reference to who. In other words, the purpose of the parables is not to obscure the message. Okay? The purpose of the parables is not because people see but don't see. There is no purpose here. So let me just translate it this way. Therefore, I speak to those in parables who seeing don't see and hearing don't hear, lest I should turn and they should be healed. Okay? So what I'm just doing here is I don't want you to get caught up on that hina in Mark. All right? And that's where a lot of people are going to get hung up there, is on that hina. Already Matthew changes the hina to a hoti already. And Luke just ignores it entirely. All right. But I thought that was important because in churches, sometimes pastors use a text like this. And they'll say Jesus intentionally spoke in parables to blind people, and that seems to me to miss the entire point of what a parable is anyway. But I don't think you have to lock yourself into Mark's hina. All right, moving on. He interprets the parable for them in terms of the various strata of the soil. And by the way, you may find it unusual that the farmer sows the seed and then he goes out and plows afterwards, but that's an ancient farming method, friends. They did not make furrows and then go plant seeds. That's much thousands of years later. They're out there just scattering the seed and then they go plow the field. And the excess seed's just the excess seed, right? The stuff that gets plowed under is going to grow, but the stuff that fell on the path by the side of the land, the roadside, as it were, or whatever, that's just extra seed. The seed that gets planted, man, that's going to bear fruit. And that's the point of the parable, is that the kingdom of God does indeed grow and grow significantly. There is something about this message of Jesus that he's proclaiming, he's saying, that falls on different types of hearers. And we're going to come in a moment to a really interesting thing Luke does here with regard to hermeneutics. But it's the different types of hearers that are being emphasized here, how we hear, how we receive this message. And so that's the interpretation of the parable of the sower. And it's pretty straightforward across all three synoptics, same kind of allegorical rendering of the parable, which leads to a second thing, and that's, did Jesus use allegory? Yes, he used allegory. Was it his dominant method? No, it wasn't. Okay, there are many methods of interpreting scripture in Jesus' day, and Jesus seems to use an awful lot of them. He uses what works in any given instance. And so in this case, he's interpreting this parable allegorically, where one thing represents another. Okay, he's watching a farmer. how the farmer does things, and he's saying, this represents this, this, and this. Okay, not a problem, but it is not his dominant method, that's for sure. Okay, so keep that in mind. Just because Jesus uses allegory doesn't mean it's a dominant method. He sure can't use it in halakhic debates like we find in Matthew all over the place. Now, we get immediately to a saying that is found in Matthew's Sermon on the Mount, and following this text of the parable, no one after lighting a lamp covers it with a vessel or puts it under a bed, but puts it on a stand, that those who enter may see the light. For nothing is hid that shall not be made manifest, nor anything secret that shall not be known and come to the light. These two sayings here have to do with the message. Once the message is out, it's not hidden away. It's not covered up. That is, it's not undiscoverable. But the message is a light, and the message you do not hide. You don't put it under something to cover it up. No. And it goes against the interpretation that the parables were meant to blind people, that is, following Mark's hina. No, this Logian is saying that's not how you do it. For nothing is hid that shall not be made manifest, nor anything secret that shall not be known and come to light. This is an eschatological saying tagged on here to this parable. And it looks back at the soils. And so there's no excuse for anybody, okay? They get to choose whether they're part of the field that gets plowed under, how they hear the message, or they're choosing these other alternatives, the rocks, the birds, the sun, etc. In Mark now and in Matthew, there's a number of other parables here that we're just going to skip over entirely because they have nothing at all to do with Luke and all the interpretation of the parables. And then we come to who are Jesus' true kindred. Okay, now here's some, again, just interesting to note. Let's observe how Mark frames the narrative. His mother and his brothers came, and standing outside, they sent to him and called him. And a crowd was sitting about him, and they said to him, "Your mother and your brothers and sisters are outside asking for you." Okay, so you have Mark, the family's out there at the edge of a crowd. They can't get to Jesus. They send someone, says they sent to him. So they sent someone to let him know they were there. Now here's Matthew. While he was still speaking to the people, behold, his mother and his brothers stood outside asking to speak to him. And then Matthew puts in his editorial comment here. Someone told him, "Your mother and your brothers are standing outside asking to speak to you." But he replied to the man who said to him, boom. In Matthew's text, the family can't get in. They send someone to him, and Jesus turns around and says, looking around those, he said, "Here are my mother and my brothers." I mean, Jesus completely ignores the family in the narrative in the Markan narrative, when he just looks around and says, "Here are my mothers and brothers." Matthew at least gives the Holy Family a little bit of a pass here. They tried to get someone to him. He knows. And then Luke says, his mother and his brothers came to him, but they could not reach him for the crowd. And he was told, "Your mother and your brothers are standing outside." But he said to them, "My mother and my brothers are those who hear the word of God and do it." So the Markan narrative, I think, gives us a much clearer historical Jesus side of things, approach to how Jesus viewed family. And this is really key here, because family has always played a significant role in human society. But Jesus is not just simply going to overturn Rome, the Roman state, Jewish state, Jewish religion, cultural religion. Jesus overturns even the most basic atomic particle of human society, which is family. Absolutely says family, blood relations, those aren't how you self-identify. And he does not self-identify that way either. There is a new way to self-identify, and that is to be part of the group that do the will of God. Those indeed become a new family. Later on in Luke, this will become the little flock. But for now, it's the new family. The next narrative is the stilling of the storm. And again, if you have a Bible, you're going to want to turn to Matthew 8, Luke 8, and Mark 4, or if you have a synopsis. The first observation is that back in the late 1950s, the German scholar Günter Bornkamm wrote an essay in a book that really opened up redaction critical studies in the Gospel of Matthew. And he used the stilling of the storm, this narrative we're looking at. And he noted something very peculiar. So I'm going to read the Mark narrative first, and then we'll look at the Matthean redaction, and then, of course, we'll look at Luke. So Mark says, on that day when evening had come, he said to them, let's go across to the other side. And leaving the crowd, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was. And leaving the crowd, they took him in with them into the boat, just as he was. Here's Luke. One day he got into a boat with his disciples. Now here's Matthew. And when he got into the boat, his disciples followed him. Now, Bornkamm noticed at this point that the verb to follow in Matthew, akaluthein, functions as a technical term for discipleship. And so Matthew is doing something here with the stilling of the storm narrative. And Bornkamm goes on to observe that in the narrative, as Matthew has framed it, the disciples follow Jesus into the boat. The boat ends up in trouble. Jesus calms the storm. Bornkamm says this is the way Matthew sees his community. They're a community of disciples in a church that's being rocked by the storms of persecution and social relations and different things. And Jesus will calm the storm. So that's Matthew. Now for Mark and Luke, it's just another day. Jesus gets into the boat. They go out on the lake. Jesus falls asleep. There's a great storm. And now let's look at the disciples' reply. So this is Mark. They woke him and said, "Teacher, do you care if we perish?" Luke. And they woke him saying, "Master, Master." Different word in Greek. Teacher's didaskalos, master is epistata. "We are perishing." So the Markan, "Don't you care if we perish?" which could be, seen as a little, a bit of an affront, as though Jesus didn't care, okay? Becomes in Luke, "Master, Master, we are perishing." And in Matthew becomes, "Save us, Lord." That is, bring us salvation. We're in the church, bring us salvation. We are perishing. And then, of course, he asks each of them, have you no faith? If I'm in the boat, is the boat really going to turn over? Is it really going to be a catastrophe? No, it's just a storm. If I'm in the boat, this is what Jesus is trying to communicate to them. So that's the stilling of the storm. And then now we come to the Gerasene demoniac. Now, I cannot do a better interpretation of this than is found in René Girard's book, The Scapegoat, on the chapter that actually exegetes this text. It's, again, it's like any other demonic activity story that we've seen so far in Luke, okay? But this one is the first one that takes place in Gentile territory. So Jesus has crossed into Gentile territory. And when he gets out of the boat, he's there at a cemetery. So this is cemeteries are places that are unclean for Jews, not for Gentiles, but for Jews that are unclean. And there is in the tombs a man with an unclean spirit. Now notice, Matthew has two demoniacs, not one, two. Mark and Luke only have one. Why does Matthew have two? Matthew does this. When you read Matthew, where there's a leper in one story in Matthew, there will be two. Where there's one demoniac, there will be two. On the right in Jerusalem, on Palm Sunday, Mark and Luke both have Jesus rides in on a donkey. Matthew has Jesus rides in on a donkey and the foal of a donkey, and he sat on them, like he straddled both of them. That's a Matthean tendency to double up things like that. Okay, so again, I don't fret about those things. I just observe it as an editorial tendency. But there is this figure who comes to Jesus. Now let's look at the Lucan narrative, because that's the one we're interested in. He stepped out on land, and there met him a man from the city who had demons. For a long time he had worn no clothes. So this is a naked man running around. He had not lived in a house, but among the tombs. Now, if he was naked, running around in the wilderness for a long time, you might call him a prophet. Just sort of a joke, but not really, but sort of. But here he is living amongst the tombs. He's living amongst the dead. He is representing the dead. Okay. When he saw Jesus, he cried and fell down before him and said with a loud voice, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God?" This "what have you to do with me" is the same language that one finds, for example, in the Gospel of John at the wedding of Cana, when Mary says they've run out of wine. And Jesus says, "What does that have to do with me? What is it between you and me? I mean, what does that have to do with me?" And the demons are asking the same thing. What are you here for? What do you have to do with us? Okay. And he commanded the unclean spirit to come out of him. And Jesus then asked him, now notice this. He commands the unclean spirit to come out, and then he talks to the what? Unclean spirit that's maybe floating in the air? I don't know. The narrative here, the problem with Luke's narrative here is that he commands the demon to come out, and then he says, "What's your name?" So maybe what he's doing is he's pulling the demonic forward into the man's personality, as it were, like a multiple personality, perhaps. He's pulling that one forward, and he's saying, "What's your name?" Now, back in the day when I was a pastor, I had the privilege of working with a psychologist, and one of my parishioners, who indeed it's now known as dissociative identity disorder. Back then it was MPD, multiple personality disorder. And my parishioner had 20 personalities. Only about 7 or 8 of those personalities were well-formed personalities. The others were these minor, small personalities that the psychiatrists got to know them all. I didn't, because they just didn't manifest, okay? But when you were talking with one of the personalities, like Justin, for example, Monica might just pop in and start talking, okay? So this is all Jesus is doing. He's saying, okay, to the demoniac, I don't know who the guy is, but I'll talk to you. And so he addresses the demon who claims to be Legion. Now, Girard observes that the fact that there's multiple here, okay, a group, and then there's the figure who, according to Mark, practices self-mutilation. And this is an important detail in the Markan narrative that is completely left out of the Matthean and the Lucan narratives. This figure is self-mutilating, okay? So Girard says what we have here is a person who has taken into their own head the voices of the community, the city, that had for some reason cast him out. And so now he is as if dead, and all those voices are in his head. Well, we certainly know this from persons who've suffered many different types and forms of mental illness. They do, in fact, take the negative voices into their head, and those do, in fact, become dominant voices. We see this today in those that are shooting up schools, malls, churches, synagogues, and mosques. There is these negative voices they hear. They're cultural voices, to be sure. They might be parental tapes. They might be voices that come from traumatic incidents. However the human psyche is constructed, these are human voices. They appear as demonic precisely because they are destructive in nature. The demonic, the dark side, it's destructive in nature. That's it. I have a lot to tell you about the dark side, but it's a movement toward chaos. If you are a Lord of the Rings lover, the best example of that is Morgoth. Morgoth was only interested in chaos, but at any rate, that's neither here nor there. So the demon will ask not to be cast into the abyss. Now, this is that Enoch myth, okay? So they don't want to be cast into the abyss. And they say to Jesus, there's a bunch of pigs over there. Why don't you let us go into the pigs? He says, not a problem. He's a Jew. They're unclean. Into the pigs they go, and over the cliff they go. And when they go over the cliff, all those voices that were in that man's head were gone. That is, Jesus demimeticized the man, is what he did, by casting out all these voices from the man's head. And notice at this point, the Gerasenes say to Jesus, you got to go. You got to go. I mean, what's he doing? He's destroying their livelihood. But he's also trying to show them something. He's trying to show them that this one who had been the scapegoat is now restored and no longer a functional scapegoat. This community is about to go into crisis again. And so they have to ask him to leave, and they do. The next is a sandwiched narrative. In other words, we're going to start off with one story, and then we're going to shift to another story, and then we're going to come back to the first story. So the first story concerns a fellow named Jairus, who happens to be a synagogue leader. And he comes to Jesus and he says, my daughter is sick and she is dying. Notice Mark, the guy beseeches him saying, my little daughter is at the point of death. Luke, for he had an only daughter about 12 years of age and she was dying. Matthew, he knelt before him and said, my daughter has just died. So Matthew heightens this now, not from a healing miracle, but now it's just right there, straight up, boom, going to be another resurrection narrative. So Jesus begins to follow him, and it's while he's following this fellow that we have that lovely story of the woman. And she says to herself, if I can just touch his garments, I will be made well. And she goes up, she touches Jesus' garments, and she is healed. Now, it's at this point that you have this in Mark. Jesus says, who touched my garments? The disciples say, who touched you? Everybody's touching you. Everybody's crowded around you. But the woman, knowing what she had done, but the woman, knowing what had been done to her, she'd been healed, came in fear and trembling, fell before him and told the whole truth. Here's Luke. Who touched me? When everybody denied it, Peter said, Master, the multitudes surround you and press upon you. And Jesus said, someone touched me. Now he is making a distinction here between someone jostling him and someone coming to touch him, someone coming to release his power. And he says, for I perceive that power has gone forth from me. When the woman saw she was not hidden, she came trembling, falling down, and said what happened. And he says to her in all three synoptics, daughter, your faith has made you well, go in peace. What is it that she brought to the table that made that happen? And here's where I have to go into my shamanic training. There's only 4 things you need for a healing: need, passion, intention, and choice. And she had them all. She brought all 4. In other narratives, you'll see, Jesus is bringing some, and the crowds are bringing others. The patient sometimes brings 1, 2, 3, whatever it is. And then there's that narrative in the Gospels where it says, and Jesus could not heal. Why? Because he doesn't bring all 4. We can bring all 4. But for the most part, 3 out of the 4, whether they come from him or us, the point is there's that cooperation that goes on. Okay? And that to me explains what's happening in this narrative as to how people could touch Jesus and not be healed, but she came with something. And what she came with were these 4 things that actually create the miracle. And then the story resumes with Jairus. They get back to Jairus's house. Everybody's weeping, weeping, weeping. They said the child died. And Jesus says, the girl isn't dead, she's sleeping. And it says they laughed at him. Notice this. He's been in this crowd. Jairus is evidently with him in this crowd. There is that little season, that story. The woman touches him, they deal with it, they ferret it out, they make their way to the house. The child has died. He says, oh, she's sleeping. And they laugh at him. Okay. He takes the child's father and mother, the 3 disciples, Peter, James, and John. They go into the room, and he says, Talitha kumi in Mark. Now, Mark gives the Aramaic formula Jesus said, Talitha kumi, which means, little girl, I say to you, arise. Matthew has, he went in, took her by the hand, and the girl arose. The magical incantation, totally removed from Matthew. Luke, he took her by the hand, saying, child, arise. So Luke retains the language, child, arise, but strips out the Aramaic magical incantation. Okay? Only Mark records the Aramaic words, which later could be perceived as magical incantation, the abracadabra type thing. So those are removed. So now we have this other raising of the dead. We've just had the widow's son at Nain. Now we've got this one. Okay? Lazarus, the Lazarus resurrection is not the only resurrection. It's just that in these other cases, the death was very recent. So it could be explained that, well, we would say today the child was in a coma or something. Or we certainly know of plenty of cases in medical history now of persons who have been pronounced dead in the emergency room, shipped off to the morgue, and come back to life in the morgue. That always used to bother me when I was a chaplain, because I had to go down to the morgue and work with the diener and get bodies and stuff. And I always used to be nervous, that someone was going to wake up when I was down in there, and I would have to go home and change my pants, and that would not be a fun thing. Okay. Now, from here at this point in Luke, hang on. I've got to skip way ahead here. I'm just going to go over here to the actual text itself. From this point in Luke, now we're going to begin to shift gears a little bit. And just as we saw the importance of the women in Jesus' ministry, now here in chapter 9, we're going to get the first mission of the 12. Now, I'm going to talk about a little bit about this now. I'm going to save the bigger part for next week, but I want you to look at this text and pay attention, because it says he calls the 12 together. He gave them power and authority over all demons and to cure all diseases. The very two things he's been doing, chapters 5, 6, 7, and 8. Casting out demons, healing people. Casting out demons, healing people. He gives them authority to do this. And he sent them out to preach the reign of God and to heal. And then there's this prescription list he gives them, and there's a reason for all of that. But I want you to notice he sends them out to do the very thing that he's been doing, to heal and to exercise, because we're going to see that these are really two sides of the same coin next week.